on the home front in the United States. There are splits that are now emerging publicly for the first time within the Pentagon. There's clearly a split between Secretary of Defense Hegseth and the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll. The United States has to look globally. We've depleted our inventory of critical military equipment to a dangerous level. And if indeed our long-term concerns are about China and more immediate concerns about Russia, then we can't afford to be hobbling along with a depleted inventory of our air defense batteries, the Patriot and THAAD missiles, as well as a lot of offensive capability.
Good evening, everyone. 6 weeks ago, Jeff Steinberg told this community what was coming. He's been right every Friday since. Tonight, he comes back to the most significant development of the war. It's a ceasefire that's already fracturing before really the ink is dry. On April 7th, 90 minutes before Trump's deadline to bomb every power plant in Iran, Pakistan's prime minister called the president and asked him to hold. Trump posted on Truth Social. Iranian Foreign Minister Arghachi confirmed on X, and the two-week ceasefire was done. Less than 12 hours later, Israel launched Operation Eternal Darkness, 100 simultaneous airstrikes across Lebanon, including the middle of Beirut, killing more than 357 people on the deadliest single day Lebanon has seen since September of 2024. Iran called it a grave violation of the ceasefire. Pakistan said Lebanon was explicitly included in the deal. Washington said it wasn't. Tehran threatened to walk out. Today, a 71-person Iranian delegation led by Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Arghachi is in Islamabad. Vice President Vance, Stephen Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are across the table. Pakistan has declared a 2-week national holiday and deployed fighter jets to escort the Iranian aircraft into Nur Khan Air Base. The Strait of Hormuz is still barely open. One sanctioned tanker transited today. Iran's chief nuclear negotiator says enrichment is non-negotiable. The 2-week window closes on April 21st. So Jeff has been building towards this moment every week. This morning, he tells us whether what is happening in Islamabad is a genuine off-ramp or a negotiating theater with missiles. Jeff, it's great to be with you, and the floor is yours.
Great to be back.
Great, Jeff. Where are we at?
Well, I think the only honest answer is it's too soon to tell. You mentioned that the Iranians have a serious delegation, 71 members. The Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, is a former commander in the IRGC, so he's clearly there representing the interest. There's basically a 5-person IRG junta that's really running the country and making the key decisions. So I think that Ghalibaf's presence indicates that at least they're represented at the table. The U.S. delegation has over 300 people, and that includes people who are technical specialists in the nuclear issues, military people, diplomats. So I think at least from the standpoint of comparing these talks to the previous talks, there's at least potentiality for serious negotiations on both sides. The reason that the Lebanon issue is so important from the Iranian standpoint is that it's a test of whether or not President Trump and the United States are going to put sufficient pressure on Israel to ensure that Israel doesn't sabotage the whole deal and move it towards a new escalation in which more and more pressure comes down on Washington from certain Gulf Arabs as well as Israel to follow through to the point of regime change. And so we know that the Lebanese and Israeli delegations are going to be in Washington. There was a conference call last night involving the Lebanese foreign minister, Israeli officials, and aide to Marco Rubio. And so it's a smart diplomatic move on the part of the Iranians. Now, I think it's also important to note that Iran has negotiated a memorandum of understanding with Oman. And so effectively, the two of them have agreed that they will take responsibility for overseeing safe transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians and the Omanis are planning on charging a transit fee, a toll booth, across the Straits of Hormuz, which has the potential to generate the kind of revenue that Iran would need to be able to rebuild after the war, if in fact the war is over. Now, I think that there is some reason to believe that there is at least a potential for these talks to go forward. And what it really comes down to is that, number one, the U.S. and the Israelis seriously misestimated Iran's capability and resilience to continue fighting. And reports that I've read this morning indicate that many of the U.S. military bases throughout the Gulf region have been damaged to the point that it's going to take major reconstruction for them to be rebuilt to be usable again. And secondly, that in some instances, like the positioning of the fleet in Bahrain, there's a much more fundamental question of vulnerability and whether it's even a viable deployment anymore. The Iranians have also suffered tremendously, and the U.S., even with depleted munition supplies, certainly had the capability, short of using nuclear weapons, to do the kind of damage that President Trump was threatening with his expletive-laden message on Easter Sunday. Now, there's also significant pressure building on the home front in the United States. There are splits that are now emerging publicly for the first time within the Pentagon. There's clearly a split between Secretary of Defense Hegseth and the Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll. Driscoll's been, along with the general who was fired as Chief of Staff of the Army, arguing that the United States has to look globally and consider that between Ukraine, Israel, and now these Iran developments, we've depleted our inventory of critical military equipment to a dangerous level. And Driscoll and others have been arguing against this kind of prolonged escalatory war because the United States needs time. And if indeed our long-term concerns are about China and more immediate concerns about Russia, then we can't afford to be hobbling along with a depleted inventory of our air defense batteries, the Patriot and THAAD missiles, as well as a lot of offensive capability. So these splits within the military have come out publicly. There was a hearing a couple of days ago of the House Armed Services Committee in which Secretary of Defense Hegseth was really pushed against the wall with both Democrats and Republicans, denouncing him, and a number of them demanding that he actually resign because of his lack of competence to do the job. Domestic political considerations in the United States are coming into play, as they are in Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu has to come up for election by no later than October of this year. Mm-hmm. And so for him, the political survival is his number one priority. And so how he handles the situation, how much the U.S. is willing to pressure Israel to actually go forward with a ceasefire, is one of the most important tests that the Iranians are going to be watching. At the same time, the U.S. has allowed a delegation from South Korea to come to Qatar to look at the possibility of unfreezing about $7 billion in Iranian frozen assets. So there are actions being taken on both sides here that at least have the feel of a more serious go-at. Vice President Vance, at the Iranian request, is leading the delegation because both Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been completely discredited, because the last time this year and last year that there were serious negotiations going on, they were used as a cover to basically launch, quote, surprise attacks against Iran. And so their credibility as diplomats is basically zero. Furthermore, from what I understand from sources in Washington, they were there negotiating on issues that they had no competence to deal with. issues like how to manage the question of assuring that Iran is not moving towards a nuclear weapon while acknowledging under the Non-Proliferation Treaty that they have the right to enrich. So there are issues related to the IAEA, related to basically inspections of not only the identified nuclear sites, but other IRGC sites where there may be underground work going on. And these guys have no competence whatsoever to deal with that. So the fact that there's 300 people representing the U.S. in Islamabad at least seems to be an indication that Vance has the authority to pursue serious negotiations if the Iranian side's willing, and if the U.S. demonstrates it's willing to basically put the kibosh on Israel taking action in Lebanon that violates the terms of the agreement.
Well, Jeff, let me ask you a couple quick questions. So Ghalibaf is across the table from Vance right now. Is he the right man to make the deal, and can he deliver on it? Because it's one of the things that, as I understand it, you mentioned that he was a former IRGC commander. He was also the former mayor of Tehran, and he's been a presidential candidate 3 times in Iran. So that's interesting, especially when he's sitting across the table from the U.S. vice president as well. So what's your take on that?
He is there representing the IRGC junta, which I think there's some reason to believe that is the case. Then he's probably the right man. He's got, as you pointed out, diplomatic credentials, but also has IRGC credentials. He was either the head of the IRGC Air Force or one of their senior commanders before he basically stepped into the political role of mayor of Tehran and then now Speaker of the Parliament. He came in as Speaker of the Parliament as part of the consolidation of power by the right-wing clerical and IRGC establishment. So to the extent that he has the green light from the junta to basically negotiate, he's the right man.
Yeah.
If nobody really representing that IRGC group that's running the country is there, then it's a charade on the Iranians' part. And we'll know that within the next day or so.
Okay. And then on the topic of Lebanon, obviously, as you mentioned, Jeff, Lebanon blew up the ceasefires during the ceasefire's first 12 hours. How does Vance manage Israel while trying to close a deal with Iran? Obviously, Pakistan said that Lebanon was in. Israel said it wasn't. The U.S. backed Israel. Iran said that the U.S. has got to choose. So it seems to me that we're a bit on the defensive there, and we've got some hard choices to make.
Yeah, the only person who's going to basically tell Netanyahu in no uncertain terms that he's got to put a halt to the Lebanon operation is Trump, period. And that's a question of political will. Is Trump willing and able to deliver that message? Is Netanyahu at a point where he's prepared to accept it or run the risk of a more significant split? There's been a lot of sort of analysis, which I think has some merit, that indicates that there's a kind of a break point that's evolving between Trump's objectives and Netanyahu's objectives. You've got a hardline faction within the region, largely represented by the United Arab Emirates on the Gulf Arab side and the Netanyahu government on the Israeli side, that believe that nothing short of a total and absolute regime change is going to resolve their dilemma. And of course, no such thing is possible without a U.S. ground operation on the scale of the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. I see no indication Trump is willing at this point to go for that, particularly with those November elections looming in the background and the Republicans were already looking pretty weak. After the tirade on Easter Sunday by Trump, the expletive-laden threat to blow Iran back to the Stone Age, you saw a number of conservatives as well as liberals, progressives, coming out and saying that the president was unhinged and that it was time to consider invoking the 25th Amendment. This included people like Megyn Kelly, Tucker Carlson, some of the people who represent a voice of factions within Trump's core MAGA base. And There was a New York Times report this week, which was a kind of a preview of a forthcoming book by two of the New York Times White House correspondents, which went through the run to Trump's decision to back Israel and go to war, focused around February 11th presentation that Netanyahu made in the Situation Room at the White House. First time a foreign leader's ever been allowed in the room even.
Yeah.
And there was nothing in that Times report that we haven't discussed over the last 5 or 6 weeks. But it did highlight the fact that one of the people who was least favorable to entering the war in the first place was Vice President Vance. And so I think that's also sort of part of the factors that prompted the Iranians to say he was an acceptable person sitting across the table.
Yeah. Well, that was my question, is why isn't it Rubio?
Well, Rubio kind of fits into the same profile as Koff and Jared Kushner. These are the people who are clearly identified as the staunchest Israeli supporters within the Trump orbit. Plus, elevating the vice president to negotiate brings you closer to the president himself. And so I think it was something that also Vance requested. He asked to be brought into this, number one, if you're looking towards 2028, and the likely competition on the Republican side could very well turn out to be Vance and Rubio. There's a little bit of elbow pushing in there over who's going to get the spotlight on the stage. So in that sense, it's a make it or break it moment for Vance also.
Yeah, and on this whole topic of the negotiations too, Jeff, Iran's nuclear chief said that enrichment is non-negotiable, and then the U.S. position requires nuclear constraints. So how does this get resolved? Because Iran's 10-point plan to end the war does not mention nuclear concessions on Iran's side, but the U.S. 15-point framework requires zero enrichment, decommissioning of all the reactors, Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, and the transfer of enriched uranium to the IAEA. So how does this all get balanced?
It's one of the sticking point issues, obviously. Again, these issues have solutions.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a genuine willingness and a felt sense of necessity on both sides to bring this thing to an end, for the Iranians, it means guaranteeing that they're not going to be facing the same situation a year from now when the U.S. and Israel have had time to replenish the inventories. And for the U.S., it means a long-term guarantee that Iran has not moved towards developing a nuclear weapon. And there's a proposal that's been made by Oman, which has tended to be the sort of broker within the Gulf Arab states, within the group, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And there's a proposal for a Arab regional consortium to oversee and manage enrichment and dispersal of material for peaceful nuclear energy and related things.
Mm-hmm.
Isotope reactors for medical treatment, things like that. So, in other words, if there's goodwill on all sides, there are mechanisms in place. I think the problem is that from the standpoint of the United States, Europe, the Gulf Arabs, and Israel, what's the lesson that's been drawn from the IRGC leadership? They look around and they see the case of Iraq, the case of Libya, where countries, South Africa even, where countries abandoned their nuclear weapons program and were targets for regime change. The outstanding example of countries that have a nuclear deterrence against regime change is North Korea. Mm-hmm. So is there really an incentive for the Iranians to basically say, we are going to verifiably abandon any kind of nuclear weapon option in the future?
Yeah.
And what do they get in return by way of guarantees of regime survival?
Yeah, and so these are the topics that are coming up in Pakistan right now as we speak. And another one, obviously, is the Straits of Hormuz. It's still barely open despite this ceasefire, and Iran's parliament is formalizing this toll regime that you already mentioned. So what's a realistic end state for Hormuz? Because they're not going to willingly give up the single most potent strategic lever that's within their kind of quiver. So what's a durable solution look like?
I think the tolls, look at the Suez Canal, look at the Panama Canal. It's not completely unreasonable that as part of some sort of a reconciliation, that there are guarantees. We don't worry about whether or not ships are going to be selected to go through or not go through the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal. We've booted the Chinese out from their contracts to control the flow of traffic through the Panama Canal, but we're not stopping Chinese ships from going through. And those toll things are, again, another framework issue. Iran is asking for reparations from the war, which was clearly a war of choice by the U.S. and Israel. And an elegant alternative to that is just, all right, let them collect their tolls. It'll be spread out. From Trump's standpoint, we don't need Persian Gulf oil. We've got a proliferation of oil and gas at home. Of course, he ignores every other commodity that is essential to U.S. supply chains that does pass through there. But leaving that little technicality aside.
Yeah. Well, did he post something on Truth Social too? Say, I want in on those tolls? So,
Yeah, of course.
How is the businessman, right? And one other question, Jeff, is something I think that's been overlooked by the media is that Pakistan just did something that nobody predicted that it could ever do. What does that mean for the region going forward? Because you've got this emergence of a country alongside China and Egypt and Turkey that's acting as a genuine diplomatic actor in these negotiations. Tell us about how that architecture of Middle East diplomacy has shifted just in the past 6 weeks.
Well, I think it's important to remember the precise sequence. There was a meeting in Islamabad involving the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. And they talked about a diplomatic solution. And they gave the go-ahead to the Pakistani foreign minister to fly literally the next day to Beijing and to bring China in as well on the good offices to negotiate, if in fact that is what's going on. But if you look at the Persian Gulf and the fact that many of the GCC countries are going to now be thinking twice about the viability of the U.S. security umbrella. These countries allow the United States to set up forward bases for the CENTCOM in their countries on the premise that this was building in security. And now they've seen that those bases have been vulnerable targets. We don't know how much it's going to cost to put them back into working order again, or whether that's even on the table. So if you look at the region, Turkey and Egypt at that table represent two countries that have a substantial industrial base and are developing a fairly advanced industry for production of military equipment. So you have the potential in all of this for a realignment in which the middle powers, the countries of the region, play a greater role and take a larger stake in their own security and cease to simply be reliant on one or another major power to be their security guarantors. And so there's a lot even more at stake, whether or not there's any way that Iran can be basically brought into that kind of an architecture. So Pakistan is a natural bridge. Pakistan has the closest relations to Saudi Arabia and extremely close relations to China. Everybody knows that if there's any sign of an Iranian breakout to actually achieve a nuclear weapon, that the Saudis are going to send a check for $1 billion to Islamabad, and there's going to be Pakistani nuclear weapons the next morning on Saudi territory as their deterrent and their sort of nuclear guarantee of stability. So Pakistan is already in that kind of a critical position. And of course, the Pakistani economy, which is fragile, very much depends on things like the China-Pakistan economic corridor, Pakistan's critical role in the whole Belt and Road process to keep their economy intact. So China has to be a backstop, but Pakistan's close relationship to Saudi Arabia and the fact that they've got diplomatic coordinated relations with Iran because they've got common security problems on their borders, the Baluchi separatist networks and things like that.
Mhm.
So in a certain sense, they're the best option in town to play this kind of a role, but they're not acting alone. They're acting with Saudi and Chinese backup for what they're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, we could talk about so many more issues, this and so many others that are out there, but we're going to intentionally and deliberately keep this short. And we'll end it here, but really grateful to you for being here with us again this week. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Good
Yeah.
to be here, John.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thank Jeff Steinberg for all of his insights. Once again, 6 weeks in, here's where we stand. There's a ceasefire, barely. There are talks in Islamabad today as you watch this. And there's a room where Vance and Ghalibaf are either building something or watching it collapse in real time over Lebanon. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally still closed. The nuclear question is still open. Israel is still striking Lebanon, and the 2-week clock expires on April 21st. Jeff has been the clearest voice on this conflict since day one, and he'll be back. Tonight's full session goes into the archive within the next 24 hours. I'm John Fensel with the Heroes Path podcast. Until next week, stay sharp, stay grounded, and lead well. Thanks, Jeff.
John.